Ever noticed how silence feels safer right up until it isn't? Leaders often think holding back keeps the peace. Most of the time, it just keeps the real work from happening. Welcome back to Data Wizardry. Today, we're exploring courageous authenticity, the creative competency that asks us to say the hard things with heart. I'm Joseph Leman. Let's put the data on courageous authenticity in layman's terms. When we examine courageous authenticity across hierarchical strata, a particularly salient pattern emerges. C-suite leaders exhibit courageous authenticity scores approximately 14 percentage points higher than those of lower-level managers, a disparity that constitutes the most pronounced inter-level differential for any creative dimension within the entire Leadership Circle Profile global database. Quantitatively, senior executives cluster in the mid-50s, or precisely around 57%. While this remains a sub-threshold relative to the commonly referenced 66th percentile benchmark for above-average functioning, it nevertheless exceeds the 43% mean observed among lower-level managers by a substantial margin. Taken together, these findings suggest a systemic, level-dependent divergence in how courageous authenticity is expressed and/or perceived. In other words, as positional authority increases, so too does the likelihood that leaders are rated as demonstrating courageously authentic behavior, marking an amplifying gradient across hierarchical levels. So in plain English, with great power comes great responsibility. CEOs show up as more courageously authentic, and because their influence is amplified, their courage, or the lack thereof, carries further. A single, bold conversation from someone at the top can shift an entire organization. For lower-level managers, then, this points to something important. Build courageous authenticity early, because if you grow this muscle now, you're far better positioned to model it when you reach roles where everyone is watching. Let me nerd out for a second, because this gap between CEOs and managers is fascinating statistically. When one group behaves differently across levels than other groups, we call that an interaction effect. For example, if depression medication worked differently on teens than it did on elderly people, that would be an interaction of age on dose. It basically means that one variable is on a different trajectory than the others. So, for every other creative dimension, the gap between lower-level managers and CEOs is modest. But for courageous authenticity, boom, biggest jump of them all. My suspicion here is that we're having an interaction between manager-level seniority and courageous authenticity when it comes to leadership effectiveness. It looks like there's a similar pattern in the data for decisiveness, which is highly correlated with courageous authenticity, and that would make it more likely that it's a real thing and not just a fluke. But we'll have to explore that when we dig into the data on decisiveness. Regardless, this interaction that we're seeing between role seniority and courageous authenticity tells us there's something unique going on here. Whether it's confidence, perception, authority, or freedom to speak truth, something changes as leaders move up. From a psychometric standpoint, courageous authenticity diverges meaningfully from the normative distributional patterns observed across other creative dimensions within the Leadership Circle Profile. Where most creative traits approximate a quasi-normal distribution, courageous authenticity exhibits statistically significant positive skewness. In practical terms, the below-average cohort is disproportionately large and indicates that courageous authenticity is structurally different across populations. Compounding this anomaly, courageous authenticity also demonstrates an unexpected correlational topology within the creative cluster. Theoretically, one would anticipate integrity, a conceptually adjacent dimension, to emerge as the strongest positive correlate. However, analysis reveal only moderate covariance with integrity, while courageous authenticity maintains substantially higher correlations with the achieving and decisive dimensions, which are more commonly associated with task intensity and assertive action than with interpersonal moral congruence. Taken together, these distributional and correlational irregularities indicate that courageous authenticity behaves as a psychometric outlier, both in how it shows up across leaders and in how it interfaces with theoretically related competencies. Here's the simple version. Courageous authenticity doesn't act like the other creative traits. Most creative dimensions fall into a nice bell curve. Some leaders score high, some low, most in the middle. But courageous authenticity? Not so much. The whole curve tilts to the side. When more leaders are scoring low than we'd expect, which means being courageously authentic is rarer than any other creative behavior we've measured. That creates a huge opportunity. If you improve even a little, you're going to stand out relative to others. And there's another weird thing the data shows. You'd think that courageous authenticity would be the most closely linked to integrity, right? Which would make sense conceptually. After all, they're neighbors in the profile. But the data says otherwise. Integrity is only moderately related. Instead, courageous authenticity is more strongly correlated with the achieving and decisive dimensions, which are traits connected to taking action and making calls. Why? We don't fully know. The numbers just tell us that people who speak up with courage also tend to be the ones who move things forward. So here's where the data leaves us. Courageous authenticity is both less common and more transformative than we expect. Most leaders score lower here than they realize, not because they don't care, but because it's far easier to protect, avoid, or smooth things over than to engage in the conversation that actually needs to happen. The numbers tell us the same story again and again. Most leaders hold back more than they think. And the ones who lean in, who say the hard things with heart, expand their impact in powerful ways. Speaking the truth with care isn't the risk. Avoiding it is. Leaders who own their voice shape the culture around them every time they speak. And that's the data in layman's terms. I'm Joseph Leman. We'll see you next time for another look beneath the numbers when we explore caring connection.